Okay. Hi. So welcome to the second segment of the day. Post. I hope everyone can hear me without a mic. So by means of introduction, I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Sarah Rabi. That's spring in Arabic. I come from Egypt. I work as a climate peace and security specialist for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIET, also known as CGIR. We are an organization specialized in climate research, focusing on smallholder farming, resilience building, climate change, water security, food security. We have over 15 hubs with a capacity of over 70 climate peace and security specialists and an overall research capacity of over 7,000 researchers across 8 different organizations.
I think he wants you to hold the microphone. Yes, he's recording.
It's not working.
Oh, it's not working?
No.
He's asking you to speak.
Can you can hear me there? Okay. Okay, so for this session, we're going to be zooming in specifically on the fragile and conflict-affected settings of particularly the Global South, and the question of climate financing. So the question of the sustainability of climate financing in fragile and conflict-affected settings, how much climate financing goes into the Global South, specifically in fragile settings. Of course, we've all heard the numbers. We've heard the 4% of climate financing versus 4% contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, the issue of climate justice, climate finance justice. So these are all issues that we have been covering past several COPs, and I think the majority of us have covered in a way during in our different capacities, whether you're working on resilience building, on climate finance particularly. So these are all questions that have arisen in our discussions. So the point now is to discuss, basically recap our different conversations within our different capacities on the question of climate financing, on the issue of why climate financing intersects with the issues of fragility, with the issues of peace and conflict, and how, in a certain fragile setting, pre-existing fragilities, whether political, economic, social infragilities, have impacted in a way the accessibility of climate finance to these regions, and how we can better respond on the local level, on the ground level. How can countries better adapt themselves and better adapt to be more likely recipients of climate financing, and also have a top-bottom approach on how we can make MDBs global financiers, how we make donors more likely and more willing to provide climate financing for fragile and conflict-affected settings. So I'll give a very brief lightning talk of a few examples on climate financing accessibility and the issue of climate financing in the region where I am mandated to work, which is the MENA region. But I'll first start by introducing a few speakers who are also going to give lightning talks based on their expertise and backgrounds on the topic. So I'll start with Liliane Haddad. Liliane Haddad is leading the EcoYouth Jordan, which is an initiative that works on climate and the interlinkages of climate and youth participation, if I'm correct, in Jordan. So she's a neighbor, just 1 hour on an airplane. And yeah, over to you, Liliane, for your lightning talk, introduction, and then we'll go over.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure being here today. Okay, because already I wrote most of the points on my laptop, so it will be with me. Hello everyone, my name is Liliane. I'm originally from Jordan. I live in the capital, you know, the Europeanization and everything, but mostly I'm from north of Jordan. So I live most of my life in the nature, and now with all the capacities within the buildings and this hard life fighting within the climate change that is happening and we all seeing. I'm actually co-founder of EcoYouth Jordan. It's a non-profit company that we work basically with technical education, vocational trainings with women, youth in the field of climate, agriculture, and environment. At the same time, I lead a project on refugee and migration, displacement within Jordan context and the MENA region. Today, my lightning will be basically more about the context of the MENA region, knowing more about the problems that is facing and how it intersect with all of the financial issues and the limited accessibility of the financial resources to these kind of countries, and how it's supposed to be there is a strategy or action plan to have more interference to that sector. So basically because maybe not all of us are well known of the climate issues that is in the MENA region, so I will start talking about the MENA, the countries that is affected mostly. So in the fragile and the conflict affected settings, like we can't find the climate action as a luxury thing in our countries. It's actually a lifeline and we can notice it daily. Now in Jordan, we are living in a dry winter, which has never happened before. And since the last 5 years, we don't have 4 seasons, we have only 2, winter and summer. So this is kind of one of the noticeable things that we can see now. But mostly the communities that serve and they are mostly living in the most affected places, they are facing this crisis of displacement, of like environmental degradation and all the resources that is feeling the scarcity. Like mostly the Jordan's one of the biggest regions that faces water scarcity in the region, also the other countries with their other problems. So if we are gonna talk about the MENA region and how it serves like the continuous species that it is, it's actually have a variety of landscapes. There is the dry desert, you can find the biodiversity with the forests, the green landscapes, and there's also, it's mostly well known for its hot and arid climate. The region, it's very rich with its nature resources, and especially with the oil and natural gas that is within the countries, but it's also complex mix of the political and social challenges that we are facing right now and we have been facing from the other decades. So mostly there is a very high vulnerability in the MENA because of the high impacts of the climate change. Mostly the MENA region and the people who are living in the MENA, they are facing very serious risks from the climate change, especially the droughts that we are facing, also the dry weather, the high temperature, also the extreme weather event. I don't know if you heard about what happened in Libya, the flood in Libya, also the flash floods that happening in Dubai, the Gulf region, also in Jordan. Mostly it's you can not all the time it's a well-known event but we feel it more in our countries. Also the other extreme events that is happening, and one of the, it's highly loud now, I don't know. I can hear myself twice. The agriculture also, which is depends on the climate, is very important in the region, because mostly in the climate negotiation we focus more in mitigation and we forget about the urgency of adaptation and how most of the countries, they are depending on their agriculture resources, the daily livelihoods that they are doing in their region. So mostly this is very important to the region and for many people, for also the businesses that they are working in many sectors in like locally, and also if we're gonna also going to the governmental work. And mostly it's all having these kind of risks, and in the upcoming years it will be rising more global temperature, and will be there more like unpredictable like rainfall and more intensity of all of these kind of causes that most of us we are feeling in specific countries globally and in the MENA region. But the main concern here when we are talking about the MENA region, it's more the vulnerability groups and the communities that are living in the south more, and how they are affected from all of each of these kind of climate urgent events. So if we are gonna, I wanna show you some numbers about most of the countries that we know. There is the NABs, the National like Plans for Adaptation, and mostly it's related to the countries and how they can play and put their goals toward the adaptation plan, the strategies they work on in each country. So the necessity of the money is very high regarding the money that is affordable and giving to the countries in the MENA. So if we are gonna see based on the NAPs, like Morocco needs about $600 million, billion by 2030. Tunisia is having identification of a need of $4.3 billion. Egypt is asking for $50 billion in conditional financing, and for Jordan it needs nearly $330 million for like urgency for its work. So if we are gonna see the needs of this kind of climate financing, it's all changed by the adaptation and mitigation practices that is needed, and there is a funding gap of about like $10 to $30 with each year with the funding processes. So this is something we need to identify. Also mostly there is, we can also cover the countries that they are under conflict and they have like wars meanwhile, and especially in North Africa, which also recorded a high level of needing for the debt situation because of the COVID-19 and what happened near then, and with the rising also interest rates and how to make more like inflation of what's happening there in the region. We can't also forget about the conflict that is happening worldwide, like the genocide that's happening in Palestine, also everything that's happening in Gaza, and also the war that happened in Ukraine, and all of these like conflicts that affect the limitation of the funding. Mostly the international like climate finance is need to be help MENA region countries specifically. If we go to the adaptation index, finance index, like there is mostly the MENA region countries, it's all underfunding, and they are needed to be like assumed all of their work, all of their goals, all of their strategies to be like more matching with the criteria that are giving from the funding, like from the donors, from the other perspective, and to need to be under specific criteria, and how to meet that criteria when you are under pressure and under funding at the same time, and to have all this going around. So this is a difficult situation, and we know like in day 5, in Friday in COP, they were talking about the NCQ like goal and how it will be more like adopt funding for the most affected places and countries, and how we can rebuild these communities by more development work, and how we can associate the countries with the opportunities that we can give. Maybe I can share a success story, because I don't want to just to talk about during the workshop. Okay.
Yes, okay.
I have a lot of
So maybe we can actually keep the point. That would be super interesting for the discussion groups. But thank you so much for the insights on the MENA region. I think it's very important to remember that the MENA region, despite the fact that I think we've all heard about the state of affairs of the MENA region right now, and the very unfortunate wars that are taking place in the region, but also the region is the driest in the world. So the MENA region is facing severe fragility and also persistent severe drought that is also exacerbating, as Lillian had mentioned. So maybe we can keep that in mind during our breakout sessions, where we're going to have to answer a couple of questions on adaptation, climate finance, and the impact of conflict and fragility on. So now I'm going to hand over to our next lightning talk speaker, which is going to be Nazanin Mushiri. No, there's been a remix. So Nazanin is a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, the ICG, who is specialized in climate, environment, and conflict, right? Yeah, so over to you, Nazanin.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to CGIAR and also for the World Bank for hosting this session. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting. Looking forward to getting to know some of you here today. So really interesting that we're calling it Development and Climate Days, Global Ambition and Local Action. I totally agree with that ambition. But also, in terms of the work that I do at Crisis Group, we have to really make sure that that local action doesn't make things worse and doesn't lead to, what we call maladaptation, or actually make the already fragile or conflict situations worse, which I think is something we need to really bear in mind when we're discussing this today. So I guess this talk, this session is about moving beyond what we all kind of look at in terms of, climate and conflict and fragility being a threat multiplier, and actually thinking about what it means on the ground. I think a lot of us in this room will know what those sort of indirect links are. I'm not going to go over them. But I think the key thing to remember is that this is not something that's really far off in the future. It's happening here and now. And what we're seeing in many contexts, and I'm based in Nairobi, I cover Africa. I've been working on Africa since 2011. I'm actually originally from the MENA region. I'm Iranian. So I understand what you're talking about, a lot of transboundary water issues as well in the MENA region. But in Africa, what we're talking about is the impacts of these climate shocks on stability, on social fabrics, on political stability too, on economic vulnerabilities that already exist in these contexts. But we also do not want climate change and its environmental impacts to become a kind of, I know I'm talking about, we're here at COP, but also we don't want to become a cop-out for governments to then use this as an excuse for poor, for weak, or for corrupt governance as well. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen too. So let's just look at the context in the Horn of Africa. There is an ongoing active conflict in Sudan that has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions of people across various borders. We have Somalia that just came out of one of the worst droughts in living memory for many people living in that region. They've also experienced floods as well in recent times. And then you have non-state armed actors like Al-Shabaab, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, manipulating these kinds of climate shocks and basically using them. And we also see this in other parts of the continent in the Sahel region as well, where we have armed groups there also using climate shocks. And we even have criminal gangs, in South America doing the same as well, using these climate shocks for their own benefits. So we are looking at extremely, vulnerable contexts where you have, many women and children and elderly that I've spoken to who are not only having to move vast distances because of climate and conflict, but also, when they get to where they are, they're also at risk as well from disease, from risk of sexual and gender-based violence. But without climate action, particularly focusing on adaptation, we're not saying that climate action can stop these conflicts, but what we are saying that they could prevent the worst possible outcomes of these conflicts, and in some cases reduce tension. So I'm going to give you just 3 examples from the ground. Is that okay? So these are examples from crisis group work. So in Cameroon, in northern Cameroon, there's been ongoing conflict there, intercommunal conflict between the Choa Arabs and the Muslim, who are fisher folk. And in that area, what we've seen is that just a bit of financing for strengthening early warning community committees has basically really had a big impact on reducing tensions and conflict there. And also these committees not only give people information from the National Climate Observatory, but they also give people better justice mechanisms too. Second example, in South Sudan, there is, I think it's the only UN peacekeeping mission that has a climate security advisor. So in South Sudan, the mission there, which is a peacekeeping mission, so there are troops there, have sponsored dialogues between various communities in areas where people are going to be moving to higher ground because of the flooding there. So those discussions and dialogues have helped to reduce tensions. But again, you know, trying to find financing and money is a bit of an issue. Now, one example I'm going to give in Somalia, which I would say is a kind of a warning to all of us, is, you know, on paper, a very positive project, which was organised and funded by the FAO and the IOM and various other local bodies, to bring two communities together who've been basically fighting over water and to rehabilitate canals there. So the beneficiaries of this were supposed to be some of the local farmers. But what the project didn't take into account was that actually the beneficiaries were going to be large cash-cropped farmers who are planting bananas. So that put a lot of stress on the soil and actually created a lot of environmental damage. Plus, what happened to these water committees that were set up, they were intimidated by Al-Shabaab. In fact, one of the canals was blown up by Al-Shabaab. Two of the people on the committee were kidnapped by Al-Shabaab. And also, is this kind of project sustainable? Yes, we all come in for a couple of years, put money in, get the committees together, but then what happens when we leave and the money's no longer there? So we have to make sure environmentally sensitive, but also conflict sensitive and are sustainable. And just a final thought. For Africa, we are looking at a $2.5 trillion gap in terms of climate financing by 2030. And we really, we're going into week 2 at COP29 now, and people are extremely nervous about what's going to come out. In previous COPs that I've been at, there's always a kind of political momentum, I would say, in week 2. I'm not seeing that right now here in Azerbaijan, so I'm very concerned. And I think it's all up to us to try to amplify this message and put pressure on those negotiators to try to come up with a deal, because we desperately need more financing. And it has to be, unfortunately, more public money, because we do not need more loans in these areas which are already suffering financially. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very difficult to summarize that. So, but I think the work that's being done on the African continent, despite Africa being extremely fragile, I think Africa is the first to develop a regional framework on climate, peace and security, which is the much anticipated common African position on climate, peace and security, which is the first endeavor by a regional entity to develop a position on the nexus. So we're all looking forward to seeing that and seeing how that's going to develop. I'm going to hand over to our third speaker. Our third speaker would be Vasilina Bello, who's the head of climate department at Eco Action from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone who was at the first session, and hello to everyone who is new on the second session. So as we are talking about Ukraine and financing of climate actions during the war, that is a difficult question, how to navigate between war and climate actions and at this time. So we face a lot of challenges, but due to the scarcity of time, I would like to probably a twofold picture. Firstly, I would focus on the state level perspective and then on the personal level perspective. So if we are talking about the state of state finances of climate action, what we are facing right now is that if not for the war, we would ask our government to allocate resources, financial resources for the local climate action. That's not the case right now, because we cannot ask the state which is under full-scale invasion with a scarcity of money for the defense purposes to allocate money for the climate action. At the same time, we, even despite the invasion, we still have some portion of money which goes from the environmental taxation fund. It is used for the decarbonization of the industry, but you know this is not the money which goes to the local communities. So basically, if we are talking about the state level and the projects we want to implement, foreign financial help, because otherwise there's no resources in our country to provide local climate actions. And the other part of the challenges which we face, this is usually left out of scope, actually, because this is a personal level, but that's what impacts us the most. So in order to find financing for the project, you need to have people, you need to have human resources. In order to implement the project, you again need to have human on the ground who will implement that project. You will need to have the person who will report on the implementation of the project. What we are facing as a big challenge right now is the scarcity of human resources. The answer is very simple. Men and women are going to war to protect our lands. So, for example, in our organization, 3 representatives are on the front line. Today, I'm here with my dear colleague Anastasia. She is a daughter of Ukrainian soldier who is currently on the battlefield. I'm personally a wife of Ukrainian soldier who is currently on the battlefield. We both live in Kyiv with our colleagues under constant attacks from Russia, and we've been deprived from normal sleep for months. During October, we had only 3 nights without air alerts. On top of that, we act as individual volunteers because, again, the state financing for the military is not sufficient. So we do whatever we can do to be, the home carer, the good worker, the good volunteer. So the pressure of what we have to face in Ukraine in order to implement local climate action is immense. But we are still trying to do that. So I would say that for Ukraine, we need also financing in the human resources to support people, to support their expertise, to support their growth, for them to be able to do something on the ground. Another thing which I want to say, that sometimes I got very amazed by the people in Ukraine, because even amidst war, those who are living near the front line, they are still caring for the climate. They are still caring to implement, small adaptation climate project. You're living 40 kilometers from the front line. You don't know your future. You don't know whether you will live the other day around. But you still want to care for something. That shows our hope. That shows resilience and resistance. And even in times of war, people in Ukraine are caring for climate. That's what we are doing today with Anastasia here. We care for our country to survive after the war, to survive amidst climate crisis, and we are here to build partnerships, to help each other, and to become stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasilina, and I think on behalf of everyone in the room, we wish for you the safe return of your loved ones. It's horrible to see so much tragedy and so much heartbreak happening around the world. But I think it's important to also reflect issue of prioritization in the midst of active war and active conflict, how important or how much resonance does the conversation on climate change and fragility actually have on the ground? How much money can be channeled into supporting the implementation of such projects that address this nexus on the ground? I think that's a very important conversation to have, but also it's also important for us that even if there is an urgent, immediate an emergency that is unfolding, that we do keep in mind, as you've said, that climate action or climate change is happening and taking place, and thus financing climate adaptation, financing climate action is still important, because if we don't see it now, it's going to catch up to us later at a certain point, and it could be too late to act then. Last but not least, Catalina. Catalina James is the head of the Climate and Conflict Department at the Red Cross Climate Center. Over to you.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. Yeah, it's difficult to follow after. Yeah, that's very kind of like important and emotional talk. And thank you so much for really sharing all this. So I'm going to take you from the Middle East, Africa, Europe to Colombia. 20 years ago, at the peak of the Colombian conflict, when we had one of the highest numbers of IDPs because of the horrendous violence in my country, I was responding to a flood that affected hundreds of IDPs. And that was like a moment that for me, it really changed my life. I was like, why? Like, this is absurd. Like, why these people are like traumatized, fleeing, living in the most precarious situations because of the war, and then on top, this horrendous flood. So that for me was a moment that really kind of changed my mind, and since then I've been working quite a lot on adaptation and disaster risk reduction. But in recent years, I had the opportunity to start to lead a team on climate and conflict that focuses on climate action for people affected by conflict in humanitarian settings. So what my team does in particular is to support the International Committee of the Red Cross to transform their operations. So I'll tell you more about it in a second. So kind of like going back again to the gaps, like what are the gaps? Why we're not able really to do climate action in conflict settings. So as the previous speakers mentioned, the financial gap. Like that is very, very, very clear. Like there is an absolutely inequality. And it's not that there is no money, because we know that there is so much investment in the military. We know that there's investment in so many industries. So the money is there. It's just the balance and the power and where the money goes. Something that I did a couple of years ago, I was a contributor author to the IPCC AR6 report, and the focus of my work was basically working in the IPCC for the evidence of adaptation in conflict settings. So everything that you look into the IPCC report, which was the first time that we managed to put into the IPCC report anything related to conflict, basically shows the evidence that there is a massive gap. So we managed to put that very clearly in the report, like on kind of like long-term adaptations as well as early warning systems. So those are like the clear like gaps that we have, and as we know, so it's the financing from one side, but also the reality of working in a conflict setting. So from one side, of course, the volatility, the violence, the logistics complications, the risk appetite. I think that's one of the big issues that we need to navigate. Like, of course, for the donors, for different people, that risk appetite and say, like, yeah, I'm going to invest the money without knowing what is going to happen the next day and dealing with the volatility is huge. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers that we need to overcome to be able to deliver and to do things. So I'm going to tell you a story that after all these years working on this really gives me like at least some hope and peace that something is changing. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, all those humanitarian organizations in the world, focus exclusively on conflict. Like their mandate is supporting people affected by conflict. So years ago, a couple of people, they started to reflect about climate. Oh, but climate actually matters for us. But in a very high-level policy, like, oh yeah, like, you know, the climate finances discussions. I bet you know that you have been very in contact with the ICRC on that. But 4 years ago, they said, well, I mean, let's how do you say in English? Let's walk the talk. Let's look into our operations. Like, what can we do at operational level to actually, through their existing programming, do adaptation? And that has been one of the most incredible things I've seen over the last years, because it is the oldest, most old-fashioned organization that you can imagine. And what we have now is unbelievable. We have developed within the ICRC one of the sharpest, most incredible framework for climate action on their operations. So it's getting into the DNA of the institution. So it is not just that they are just doing projects here and there, but we are basically looking into how in their financial planning that they do every year, they will integrate climate within the process. And that is just incredible. Few things that are just really remarkable in terms of like how the operations are started to switch. So let me start with Ukraine, because it's quite special what just happened, like this year. So the ICRC works in the contested territories. There are no other organizations, or very, very few, that are really working in, you know, in the most kind of like complex parts. And they do a lot of infrastructure-related projects, like water infrastructure, like reconstruction of things that have been damaged at different levels. So we have been working with them to integrate climate risk, basically climate projections, storylines, to understand how underground water, the infrastructure could be damaged under different scenarios, and that being integrated into the design of the new systems. I mean, that is just very straightforward. Like, it's so clear adaptation in something that is already on the making, is already a process that they are doing, but now with that additional element. Another really fascinating case was Somalia last year. So the ICRC never uses a forecast, ever. Like, that's like, weather forecast is that's not my thing. But it's changing. So last year, probably many of you heard about, there was a El Nino forecast, the probability of floods in Somalia. So we work with the ICRC operations in Somalia first, from the basics, like trying to explain what El Nino was and what the forecast was and the probabilities and the reliability, and like, because they needed to take decisions, like very important decisions. Once they took the decision and said, okay, no, this matters to us, they stopped their operations, switched the programming, and put 6 million CHF into an incredible early action process. Not everything worked well, and they recognized it because it was a learning process, but it just, you see the change of mentality, and that is huge because they are working in Al-Shabaab operated areas, in areas that are very complex to get in. And my last example, which I think is also very, I bet you never, is a very particular case. There was a alert for heat waves in the Sahel last year, like one of the worst heat waves in the Sahel. Like, it was terrible. So the same thing, we're working with the ICRC teams to the heat waves, like the probabilities, and they figured out they could take it or not. They work in jails. They are the only actor that works in jails. So basically, based on the information and that kind of like taking a decision based on the forecast, they managed to do some very basic but very important actions to protect inmates in jails, like making sure that they had electricity, because in Bamako, for instance, in this moment, there is like power outages that are happening. So they make sure that the fans were working, that there was water, that there were like certain elements to minimize basically the risk of death because of heat waves. So these are at least just show us from the humanitarian perspective how an actor that has the access and the possibility to get into conflict areas, some of the most complex areas, is integrating this, which was something that it was absolutely, not in my dreams I thought that we will do this in like 4 years. And what is very exciting of all this process is that we are supposed to do this integration of climate risk into the operation. And I'm just going to start as well, my team, to do the same with the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I think that is just such a good kind of example of how a system that didn't really integrate these things is kind of shifting. So of course this is a piece of the puzzle, but it kind of demonstrates that if these organizations that are so robust, so old-fashioned can change, I think we all can change. Thank you.
I'm not going to call it old-fashioned. You can call it that. I'm not going to do that. But I like what you said about changing the DNA of an organization. In many ways, we maybe can call it adding a climate lens to our interventions, or graduating from humanitarian need-based one-off assistance to sustainable climate financing, because we cannot keep on. It's extremely expensive to deal with climate-induced emergencies with need-based or humanitarian assistance and just keep on repeating that cycle, whereas we can graduate into more sustainable financing mechanisms that ensure that these people on the ground, these fragile communities, get the sustainable support that they need to build their resilience and to overcome this issue. That takes us to the issue of course, as you mentioned, donor appetite, and what does it mean, and why don't donors, how can we maybe motivate the donors to develop an appetite towards investing in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Thank you all for your lightning talks. Can we give a big round of applause for our speakers? It was extremely challenging to ask them to stick to 3 or 4 minutes. That was very anxiety-inducing, I understand, but thank you for making it as brief as possible. We can now move on to the second session, where we will have more focused group discussions on 2 questions that we have randomly written down on each of the flip charts. So each table, we're supposed to be on 3 tables, by the way, so we were going to have to ask 1 table. The extreme inconvenience of having to move to another table. I think you guys are, this is the smallest table, so if you could please join another table. I think this one, I think we'll need to fill out this table anyway. So maybe if, so merge, yes, so we can merge this table, and then this table is, I think, good on its own, and then we have this table. The nearest flip chart to you is going to be the flip chart with the questions that you will have to answer. So this is your, no, they're different. So each group gets 2 very random sets of questions. This is going to be your questions, and then we're going to have to move this one here. Sorry. So the questions cover different topics. The nexus of climate adaptation and peace building, or actually climate finance and peace building. What you mean? Yeah. Yeah. So basically, no, 1 moderator for each table. So you can moderate this table, you can moderate that table, and then moderate, and you can stay here. So, yes, thank you so much for moving it. Okay, so the questions cover climate peace building and finance. COP29, COP28, the declaration, we've all heard of the COP29, COP28 declaration on peace. There is also the Baku call for climate and peace, which was just launched yesterday by the Baku presidency. There is also the quantified goal, loss and damage. So these questions ensure that we kind of cover all the missing or potential gaps in the conversation of the climate peace and climate finance conversations. What can be done, the lessons learned and the main challenges, and also how can we ensure that climate financing mechanisms adapt to fragility, whether arising, exacerbating, or newly induced fragility. So each group will have 20-25 minutes potentially, so 25 minutes maybe, to discuss the questions, and then we can assign 1 repertoire from each group to present the outcomes of the discussion to the group in plenary. So starting now, you have 25 minutes, so we can reconvene 10.
Sorry, I want to just, yeah.
In the case of Nigeria, which is like the northern part,
Okay.
US support terrorism, obviously, over the last year, the police has engaged migration.
Can you be the first to present of your group? So basically, you're just going to have to tell them what the questions were. Yani tell the groups what the question were. And then just present, but very briefly, for 1 minute on the outcomes of your discussion. But we're going to have to keep very harsh deadlines عشان they want to kick us out of the room. We have very little. So they want the room for another event. Okay, so you? Okay. I thought so. It's also Liliane on the spot there. It's fine. Okay. So you're the repertoire as well?
I guess, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So we're going to start with the plenary discussions now. If we can all reconvene in plenary. So for our first repertoire, Catalina, you're going to be telling us what the questions were for your group, and also very, very briefly in 1 minute.
Oh my God, that's so difficult for me. I'm Colombian, don't ask me that. Okay, oh my God, we have such a rich conversation. I love it. I wish I had recorded that. We can have a paper out of that conversation. So, in what ways can climate finance contribute to peace building in fragile conflict-affected states? So, I think that we tackled really. I think at one of what is your name, dear? Yeah, B2 bingo. Oh my God, that's a difficult one. Okay, she's made an excellent point as well as you. First, we need to look at the root causes. Why the conflict is actually happening in these places? Because when we really tackle that, then is when we look at the need of like climate justice elevated to the extra level. Because then we know that that creation of vulnerabilities and the root causes of the disaster are for many reasons that we know. Colonization, you name it. No, so I think that's a very important element. So we are talking about the need of climate finances in these places. It's like, well, like the root causes have been created for a lot of these injustices. So therefore, that need of climate finances is not only because we have current vulnerabilities, but it's because, we need to tackle a bigger picture. So I think that was a general. But I think there was an excellent point as well on clearly the importance of investment on that community-based, let's call it disaster risk reduction, adaptation, whatever, but that process from the bottom is super essential to basically create social cohesion, which is going to lead to, in a way, peace building. So I think that's another important. But then you made as well an excellent point that I want to highlight, is that we need to understand, even from a very totally different perspective, from the carbon credits side of things. So if that will become like a big issue, we need to be very mindful of how this can create, in a way, like a push factor of people out of their lands, which we have seen in the past with, monocrops in many places, that becoming a source of displacement and conflict. So I think we need to rethink very well how that is going to take place, because in places that already are fragile, where there are already conflicts, where land is complicated, if you just add that economic additional factor, it's like a cocktail for disaster. So that's like one. And then the next point, what are the main challenges faced by the donor countries to put money for climate finances. So I think we highlighted, so I think that element of the risk appetite is a big one. Like just really basically not wanted to put money because the volatility it's quite big, because of course capacity of delivery of being implementing in this context is very complex. But basically what we discuss is that it is not impossible. It's just that it needs to have a very different approach to the traditional one. So we talk about that need of like flexibility on the systems. It has to be a different way of like how they will finance the systems. But then very importantly is that element of like who is going to implement. And I think that is one of the biggest cases for localization that we have. Because we know clearly that in a very complex area where you have like non-state groups that is just difficult to operate, it's the local organizations are the only ones that will be able to do it. And it could be like from the church, not how do you call it, faith-based organizations, or others that are really trusted and that really can do things. So that's a massive case for actually being able to do that delivery on that. And I don't know if I'm missing any point. Oh yeah, the diversity. I think that element of diversification of funding is very important, and I think it makes me think about the example that I gave you on the ICRC. So it's not that we need the humanitarians that have access to do their bit. We need the other kind of funding sources to do their bit. So we need these kind of like pieces of the puzzle, like really well orchestrated in these places, because there is not just one single solution. Thank you.
2 minutes on the dot, thanks. Thank you, and you've kept it for 2 minutes. That's amazing. Nazanin, over to you.
I'll come over here. Hi, so we had a really rich discussion over here, and it was great because we had, obviously perspective from Ukraine, Azerbaijan. We had some agricultural experts, finance experts, humanitarian development experts. So we had a very, very rich discussion. I think our questions are they're kind of similar. The first question was, how can climate finance mechanisms effectively adapt to fragility, ensuring both climate resilience and conflict sensitivity? So one of the points made in our group was that we need a holistic approach. We cannot operate in isolation and in silos, and I think it's very, very important that that's the approach we use. Another point was that just generally in climate mechanisms at the moment, finance mechanisms, there's very little conflict sensitivity, and the level of analysis is very low, so we need to improve that. Also, the way that these mechanisms are designed and structured, they're designed and structured like banks. Basically, it's very important that we kind of think about the way that they're structured if we're going to be able to effectively address some of these issues. Just in terms of the Ukraine context, I think it's important, the point made by our Ukrainian colleagues here, that the money being sent there is obviously being focused on security and dealing with the issues to do with the war. But there are, even in the Ukraine context, some great examples where we're seeing a certain level of flexibility from, for example, the EBRD, which is the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, where they are focusing on energy security projects in Ukraine, using solar panels to bring energy, but also bring security to substations. And women are actually taking over these roles and systems and operating. But again, there is limited funding, of course. There are issues with donors in these fragile areas, and perhaps getting in the right agricultural technology would lead to a return of investment, and perhaps drought-resistant crops, Vic was given an example, could help with these finance mechanisms effectively adapting to these contexts. Just on the second question, which was more on what opportunities exist, we had a lot of examples from Ethiopia, from Afghanistan, which I think is really great. But one thing that we need to really bear in mind, which I think is important, is that donors love to hear from us that you are reducing displacement, migration, etc. So I think it's really important that we don't overplay that, and make sure that when we're talking to donors, that we make sure that we're not overplaying the migration displacement line of what we're trying to do. Also, a really important point that we had to do with COP. Currently, obviously, the Azerbaijani presidency is leading the negotiations on this new cooperation over financing, the NCQG, I think it's important that it focuses on adaptation costs, because then if you focus on adaptation, you can reduce the money you need for loss and damage, which I think is really important. We also talked a lot about Ukraine as well in terms of restoration of destroyed ecosystems, many parks that are occupied, the demining of many of these conflict-ridden areas of the world, including Ukraine. And we also spoke about Nigeria, where armed groups are operating. Maybe we need to invest more in grazing reserves and restoring land. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Last but not least, Liliane Haddad, in 1 minute. So your challenge is not reporting, it's the 1 minute.
So we had a fruitful discussion actually. We discussed more the second question more than the first question. The first one was talking about more success story about adaptation. The second one was talking about peace building within the conflicts and adaptation measures and mitigation also, and more like overview from the COP perspective. So the discussion was basically talking about the peace building and how it's sometimes important to have the mitigation part from tools and joint interest parties to have more engagement in common solution when they are working together. Other part focus on that we don't have enough case studies that shows and bring like more projects and climate action within biodiversity, that declining money and how to build on different perspective from local approaches. And within also if we are gonna to the peace building, depending on where we are applying the peace building, if it's very big conflict zones or it's small regions that internally have conflicts in between, and how to have agreements. Sometimes we have the politician and the political situation agrees on big solution, but in the context of population they don't have the same solution, but they agree within the system forcefully or not. So this is another part. Also there is including more climate data and science to be integrated, especially in the programming and financial parts, and how to include the communities that work within the context of adaptation and other projects. And here Jana emphasized that it doesn't matter if it's like mitigation or adaptation, as long as we are working onto like building the synergies of these communities and we are doing an action on the ground. Also the assist local knowledge and how the climate institution to be more integrated in the work. And sometimes we have this success story, but it's not officially reported and like shown out clear to the public, and so we need to do more on the ground on this. Also integrate the humanitarian on designing and to have a common language when we are talking about climate financing, and also at the same time taking charge of the social challenges within. And thank you. Is it 1 minute?
Yes. Thank you so much. I hate to be the person to rush everyone, but thank you for the fruitful discussions. And I look forward to maybe hearing more your comments, your feedback over coffee. We have the coffee break now outside, so please do join us for a further discussion. And thank you again. We're done. See? Thank you.